Today, and Rick just asked me to take this time to tell stories, and so I thought I would just take an opportunity to tell some stories. And I used to be really self-conscious about telling stories, but I recognize that God is making investments in our lives experientially. It's not just academic. The understanding of what God is doing in our lives is also experiential. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you this morning is just my experience of what the Lord did with us as we were on this journey. For those of you that don't know, this is Weston. He's my oldest son, and Aiden. And I have Krissa and my wife with me. And the two boys and I went on a hike in Israel. We started in the middle of March, and we finished in the middle of May. So it was a 2-month hike, and we covered about 550 miles of walking. And I'd always wanted to go to Israel, and I thought that this would be a good way to do it without going on tour buses. And I also wanted to do something hard with the boys. And when I learned that I was wrong, that was hard on me, but it wasn't so hard on them. So I got one of the objectives accomplished, and then I just got really stretched in a lot of different ways. So I hope it'll be a blessing a little bit this morning. During the Bible study time, I want to talk about some cultural revelations that I had about the Jewish people. I thought I understood the Jewish people. I thought I shared a lot in common with them because we keep the Sabbath, we keep the holy days. But in reality, we're very different in a lot of ways. And I think it's really good for us to sort of understand their take on the world and some of the things that we observe. And then this afternoon, or after this, during the sermon, I'm going to talk a little bit about exile and being sojourners and what that felt like as far as being in a foreign land and walking in the footsteps of so many of the exiles that are talked about in the Bible. So first I'd like to talk about some cultural revelations. It was really interesting. As we went to Israel, everyone was like, oh, it's going to be so unsafe. Can't you see all the protests that are happening? There were 100,000 people protesting in the streets of Tel Aviv when we showed up. And what they were protesting about was judicial reform. Is anyone following the news about what's going on in Israel right now? This is such a turbulent time in Israel that as we walk through the land, it was on everyone's mind. Everyone said, this is the end of Israel as we know it. This is going to end what we have created here in the Middle East. And what it is a realignment of power. So currently there's a balance of power between the judicial and the executive branches in the Israeli government. And there's a struggle going on right now because the judicial side of the government, just like our Supreme Court, has a lot of ability to override the executive branch. And so what's happening is that the religious right, the observant Jewish population, represented by Jerusalem basically, is saying we would like to consolidate power away from the judicial branch and into the executive branch. Because we would like to be able to make rules and laws and not have the judicial branch overrule us. Whereas the left, the secular side of Israel, which is represented by Tel Aviv, is saying you're getting rid of the balance of power. It's all going to end up in one place. So there's this huge power struggle going on within Israel right now. And the Israelis seriously think that this may end. Joe Biden and our current administration has put their weight a little bit behind the secular side. And so there is a feeling from the people in Tel Aviv that thank goodness America has stepped in and kept this balance of power. Otherwise it would just all swing and consolidate under the executive branch. So Israel is very much a divided land politically, but also from the perspective of community. I was really surprised. Here in the United States, we're a melting pot. We have a lot of different cultures that come together and live together. But in Israel, as you're going through the communities, you'll go to one community and you'll see the synagogue. You'll go to another community and you'll see the mosque. People do not live together there. There are separate communities. There's a Druze community, There's a Bedouin community, there's a Jewish community, there's an Arab community. They don't interact. And it's really apparent. It was something I didn't realize, but sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. When you read about the Old Testament, they went to Ashdod, here was like the Philistines, you went to this city, it was a different city. They're all in there together, but it is very different cultures and communities. And what's really interesting is that Weston, Aiden, and I could go hiking through an Arab community, and there would be signs up that said Jews are not allowed. There were places in Israel that we could go as Americans and as Christians that even the Jewish population can't go into. So I was really surprised that the government provides a separation, and one of the things that was really evident is we kept Passover in Jerusalem, and so Passover fell on Thursday, and so we had Friday open. We didn't want to get back on the trail, so we stayed with some friends, and we went into the old city. Well, that happened to be Good Friday, Ramadan, and Passover. So it was, the military presence was enormous. I mean, there was military and police everywhere. There were drones flying overhead. It was just a really crazy period of time, and every time Weston and I and Aiden got in the old city and we're wandering around, we get lost. They're like, you can't go down this. Only Muslims are allowed to go there. You can't go here because this is where another group of religious people are. But it's mainly Muslims you couldn't approach, and there were streets off. And the Jews, the religious observant Jews, are pretty upset these days because the government has told them they cannot go to a lot of places within Israel because the government wants to sustain peace with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, with the Druze, with the Bedouin. So there's a lot of places where Israelis are not allowed to go, Jewish specifically, that all of the rest of us are permitted to go in their own country. So there's very limited integration between the different cultures. And a lot of people are trying to overcome that, especially the secular Jews have a lot of nonprofits, NGOs that are out there trying to establish unity within the land. But you have the observant Jewish population, or the Zionists. They're like, this is our land, everyone out. So you kind of have this polarization. You have the Zionists saying, this is our land, let's push out the Arabs, let's make this more uniform. And then you have the secular side saying, hey, let's integrate everyone and let's work together. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Because of the secular religious divide, a lot of the perspective in Israel is that the rest of the world hates them. When I would tell them, no, not everyone in the United States is against you, I almost saw tears in people's eyes because they feel like they're very isolated. They feel like Europe is already lost. Europe is already sided with everyone else. And they also are concerned about the U.S. drifting away also. They do see U.S. as being a prime ally because right down the street, Harry Truman, he was very instrumental in the establishment of the state in the 1940s. But they are very concerned about isolationism, and they recognize that they may have to work unilaterally on situations like Iran, where they're developing nuclear weapons. They don't trust that the U.S. will step in and help them. So they really feel like we're becoming more and more isolated, we're more and more by ourselves, and we also feel this divide within the country. So there's a lot of pessimism within Israel these days, from isolation, from division, and from others. Now, one of the things I observed while I was there is something that gave me a lot of optimism. And so I was like the person speaking optimism into the Israelis while they were there. They were all very pessimistic based on what was going on in their culture. And my optimism was built around Weston, Aiden, and I hiking the trail. And so when you're hiking the trail, there were not many North Americans. There were a few Europeans, but by far 95+% of the people we ran into were Israeli. And what that looks like is that when Israelis graduate from high school, they go into a GAP program, generally. And in that GAP program, they go out and they learn about the land, they learn about their culture, they learn about religion, and they take a year off high school. it also prepares them for the military. Because everyone in Israel, men and women, go into the military except for the ultra-Orthodox. The ultra-Orthodox get a bye to study the law and the Torah and the Mishnah. But the rest of the population goes into the military. And for women, that's 2 years, and for men, it's 2 years, 8 months. When they finish this program, they have taken on a sort of a cultural pilgrimage to walk the trail, especially those that are religious, because in Genesis it told Abraham, go walk the land. And so Israelis between ages 22 and 23 are out on the trail walking. Or they end up going to Asia, or they really like South America. There's places in South America they said they can go and people speak Hebrew there, because there's so many Israelis hiking. And they usually take a year. So they've taken a year off. They've taken a year off. I'm up. They've taken a year out of high school. They've taken 2 or 3 years in the military. They've taken another year to travel. And then they're getting ready to go into education and begin their college. So they're very delayed. But we may look at that as like, man, these kids are just not growing up. They're just taking forever to graduate. And some industry says that. But what I saw is 22 and 23-year-olds that are compassionate, that are mature, and that have a vision for a better world. And so I was just floored by these young men and women out on the trail that showed Weston, Aiden, and I tremendous compassion, that showed great example of what it looked like to serve and to be helpful, and just an amazing foundation that had been established of love of country through that gap year after high school, and then serving in the military. So Weston got a few recommendations to come and join the Israeli Defense Force. I don't think he's going to take him up on that. But it is a really amazing, what shall we say, a cauldron to sort of mature the young people. And when you have a base of young people that are that mature, I think your future is really optimistic. And I had to continually remind them of that optimism. Yeah.
I have a question. You talk about the trail. Is this a specific trail that,
That's a great question. So Israel has a lot of trails. So they have the Gospel Trail, and Aiden and I always laugh because the Gospel Trail, every time we came across it, it was well marked, it was paved, and it was wide. And so we always laugh. There's the Sea to Sea Trail, which goes from the Mediterranean Sea to the Kinneret or the Sea of Galilee. But what we took is the Israeli National Trail. And it starts at the Red Sea. So it goes from the Red Sea through the Negev Desert to the Dead Sea to Jerusalem, then from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, then Tel Aviv up the coast of the Mediterranean. Once you get up by Haifa, it cuts across over the Mount Carmel, Mount Tabor, which is Mount Transfiguration. You end up going to the Sea of Galilee, and then you go up to Mount Hermon. So you're basically going from, we could have touched the Egyptian border on the south, and we were within a stone's throw, maybe like, I can't throw a rock that far, less than a quarter mile from Lebanon, and then Syria was within sight. So it's basically covering the entire country, and it was created off of the inspiration of the Appalachian Trail here in the U.S. So in the 1980s, a man came over from Israel and walked the Appalachian Trail and said, we would like to see something like this in Israel.
How many miles?
So we walked over 550 miles, so we missed a couple sections. It's around 700 total. And if we had not taken the Sabbath, and if we had not taken Passover and other things like that, we would have had plenty of time, but I had to miss a couple sections in the hike. And for me, I've always been driven, like, gotta get done, gotta go here, get this completed. It's really important to do all the I's. And on this one, I kind of gave up and I said, it's more important that we make a good family investment in time and not complete like every inch of the trail and just enjoy the journey. And I think there's a life lesson there for sure of do we make it about the destination, or do we enjoy the journey along the way?
Ryan, tell them just real quick, the one little journey, you were gonna go up to the mountain, but you decided not to because of the festival they were having.
Yeah, I'll definitely talk about that for sure. Yep.
You said that they are on this path for like a year, like the GAP program, so they walk this path for, who funds that?
Yeah,
mean,
so
does
I need to
they have
back up a little
eat?
bit, because I think I miscommunicated.
Oh,
So right out of high school, they go through a GAP program, and they generally go to a school. And it's like called a field school, and the kids all live together, and they'll go home on the weekends, but during the week they're together at the school. And in those schools, they learn about the culture, they learn about camping, they learn about the military, they learn about the history of Israel. It's kind of an indoctrination into the land and the culture of Israel. Because you have to remember, Israel is a land of immigrants. And I'll talk a little bit more about the immigration and what that's done. But the trail is after, so you do high school gap, and you're not walking on the trail then.
right,
Then you do the military, and you're walking all over the place, but it may not be on the trail.
right.
And then when you get out of the military, that's when they take the opportunity to walk. And the trail only takes about 2 months to do, plus or minus.
Okay.
But then they go for another 10 months to South America, or they go to
Yeah, they're just
Thailand, and they
how do
hike.
how do they fund that though?
That's a great question. It doesn't seem like they're as infatuated by the American dream. If they have money, I get the feeling that they spend it. And so in the military, they get paid. So they
Right.
use the money they get paid in the military to fund that next year of travel.
Got it. Okay.
And then the gap year right out of high school, I believe, is sort of reimbursed possibly by the government and by parents as part of just sort of a extension of high school,
Got it.
essentially. Sorry about not making that more clear.
Where do they go in South America?
So they love, a lot of people said their favorite place was Guatemala,
Guatemala's beautiful.
but they also talk about Bolivia, Peru, Argentina. A lot of them will start like in Argentina, they'll go through Chile, then they'll come up through Peru, Ecuador, over to Colombia, to Brazil. They basically tour the whole thing, which is really crazy just to think about being displaced for 10 months and just wandering around a foreign country.
Yeah.
But they learn a lot, they get a lot of exposure to other cultures. And so that is becoming part of the fabric of their culture. Military service, understanding their culture, hiking in foreign countries. This is the foundation that they're creating in their culture before their young adults actually go to college, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
It's way different. I mentioned that it's a land of immigrants, and I'll tell you 2 stories about immigrants. The first one is they were celebrating Independence Day, and you guys, when I get to the point where you don't want to hear anymore, or we just run out of time, just let me know, because I could talk here for like hours. But I hope you're finding it interesting, and I love like the questions, so don't hesitate to ask the questions for sure. Weston, Aiden, and I were hiking. We recognized it was Independence Day for Israel. And people said, you're not going to be able to find a campsite. And so we don't have a choice. We're going to sleep outside no matter what. We have to. We don't have any other place to sleep. So we're hiking, and we start seeing the forest just full of people. And Independence Day is a big deal in Israel. It didn't happen very long ago. It wasn't like in the 1700s. It was like 60, 70 years, 75 years ago. It was 75 years ago this year. And so we get to where we're camping, and it is just like a carnival. There are people everywhere. And so I get Weston and Aiden, and I'm like, man, I think if we just stay here long enough, people will just go home. They're just out here barbecuing and stuff. And so we just sit down underneath a tree, and this man walks up to us, and he says, here, you want some watermelon? And I was like, sure. And I think Weston got all the watermelon before I even got a bite. He was hungry. Aiden might have got 1 bite. So they just kept on feeding us watermelon, and then he was like, come with me, come with my family, you can celebrate with us. And so we go over with this man, and he starts telling us that his family immigrated from Ethiopia, and that he represented Israel in the marathoning. So he had gotten, what, 5th, what? 13th place in the Boston Marathon. And then he starts introducing me to all of his family, because this is extended family. And his sister walks up, and she speaks really good English. And I said, wow, you really speak good English, because not everyone in Israel speaks good English. And she said, well, yeah, last week I just got back from Harvard. And I was like, what were you doing at Harvard? And she said, well, I'm on the judicial staff of the Israeli government. And the Israeli government, I'm a lawyer, and they sent me over to Harvard for a year of continuing education. And then she introduces me to their nephew, and the nephew just got out of the military and is a decorated war hero there in Israel. And then she introduces me to their other brother, who walked from Ethiopia through Sudan and actually made it to Israel. And so here you have an immigrant population that is making a tremendous difference within Israel. See, Israel is basically a land of immigrants, more so even than the US. Everyone has migrated there. In the 1990s, there were like 1.5 million Russian Jews that immigrated from Russia to Israel, in a population that's probably only about 15 million. So they saw 10% increase in just Russians coming in, and they were talking about the brightest people out of Russia were the ones that migrated into Israel. So their whole hospital system began to speak Russian. And so the nurses had to learn how to speak Russian because all the doctors were Russian. Well, Israel is the #1 startup company of new businesses in the world. They are a very small percentage of the world, but they are leaders in the tech industry. So a lot of your apps, a lot of your computer systems are coming out of Israel. And most of that is attributed to the Russians. So the Russians came in and they brought a lot of technology into Israel. So Israel is very much a land of immigrants, where immigrants are making a very positive investment in the community. So not only do they have really amazing young men and women, I mean, we saw women that were smaller than Aiden, carrying packs that were 2 or 3 times my weight, going up hills faster than me. I mean, just little dynamites. It was amazing. So they have an immigrant population that is making very positive contributions to their society. And they also have young men and women that really are amazing as far as their attention to other people, their kindness, their hospitality, and their drive. And so talking a little bit about hospitality, when we were hiking on the trail, the Israelis would start when the sun came up, and then about 2 hours in, they'd all sit down. And we wouldn't see like tons of people on the trail, but when you crossed a group of Israelis that were hiking, the first thing they would do is say, come over here. And so you'd come over, and they would say, we have some coffee, would you like some coffee? And Weston made the mistake a few times of saying, yeah, that would be great. And tell them a little bit about the coffee.
So their coffee is called Turkish coffee. And what see, you have to know how to drink it. Later I found out that I was drinking it incorrectly. But what they'll do is they'll take a cup and then they'll pour some hot water in, and then they'll just dump some grounds in, and they'll hand it to you.
Oh.
And you have to wait for the grounds to settle to the bottom, and then you drink the top of the coffee. But yeah, it wasn't very good unless you knew how to drink it.
So coffee was a big deal there. I even drank a cup of coffee, and I don't think I've ever drank coffee in my life before, just because I didn't want to create offense. And then if they have food, they're going to share food with you. It's part of their culture. If they see somebody going down, walking along, they're going to invite you to share in their meal. The meals are really important. So it just really convicted me, am I doing the same thing to people here in the United States, the immigrants, the foreigners, the sojourners? Because that's part of their culture.
Do they pray before or after they eat?
Oh, I love that question, Dusty. All right, let's talk about that real quick. All right, in Deuteronomy, it says, when you enter into the land and you eat from vineyards you did not plant, and you live in houses you did not build, and you enjoy all this bounty, and you're full and you're satiated, what do they tell you? What does God tell you to do? What's that? Well, it says, don't forget. Yeah, don't forget about me after I've blessed you in all these ways. So the Israeli practice is to pray after a meal, not before the meal, because the thought process is it's after you've eaten, after you've been satisfied, that you're most at risk of forgetting where those blessings came from. So the Israelis pray at the end of meals, not at the beginning of meals. That's not quite true. They pray all the time. They sing all the time. So we'll talk a little bit about that, because it is a very lyrical culture. And I'm only talking about the Israelis because I didn't get a chance to interact with the Palestinians, with the Bedouin, with the Jews that often. So they opened up their homes to us. Even, I had to disclose, I'd say, I'm a Gentile, I'm a Christian, and I'd like to keep the Sabbath with you. I'll explain that that is not the way to win their hearts. And I'm going to jump a little bit. But they would invite us into their home, and they would start with Friday prayer, and they would bless the wine, and they would bless the bread, which is a lot like communion, because but they don't understand Christ. But they're essentially observing the communion. They're breaking the bread, they're drinking the wine. And then I thought, oh, I understand that. And then after that, they go wash their hands. So I was like, let me be a smart American and ask a bunch of questions after they wash their hands, after they bless the bread and bless the wine. And it was like, we're sitting at their table like, I was like, oh, come on, I really want to know about this. And then when their daughter came back, she was like, listen, we can't talk until we've washed our hands. So there is a lot of cultural awareness that if you're going to be in a Jewish home during a Sabbath that I didn't know anything about. So I was always a little bit awkward, but they were really gracious, which was really amazing to have that graciousness. The first time we kept Sabbath with Jews, we were at a Hillel center. It's an evangelical center to bring secular Jews into more observant Jewish. And they have people out on the streets that are binding the law in your hands and on your head, and they ask you, do you want to have this happen? But so we were with 70 Jewish kids and then the rabbi. And dinner started, and it was like, all right, we had fish, I'm done. No, we have chicken after that. We have this, and the meals go on forever. There's a lot of singing, a lot of praying that I don't understand because it's in Hebrew. They actually invited us to go to synagogue. And this was a Sephardic Jewish, not an Ashkenazi. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, Sephardic are all of the Arab Jews that were displaced. They generally were considered the underclass because the Ashkenazi came out of Europe and they were more wealthy. So there has historically been a separation between the two. Go ahead.
Was there always somebody there to translate for you?
No, it was speaking in tongues, 100% with no translation.
So how did you know what they were talking
It
about?
was super awkward. You sit in a seat and they all stand up and you're like, oh, I better stand up. And they all sit down, you better sit down. And then they're singing. I have no idea what they're singing about. It was just crazy that we were allowed to come into their synagogue. And I thought synagogue was going to be like here. Like, we all walk in, we soberly sit in our seats, we listen to somebody, then we get up and we go about our business. There, during synagogue, I mean, here they're singing, there's like, hey buddy, good to see you this week, and he's walking over here and talking to you. I mean, there's like this social gathering going on. It's not a very structured environment, but you have to remember, they go for like 3 hours Friday night, then they get up in the morning, and they go for like 3 hours in the morning, they come back and have a long lunch, then they go back, and then they do evenings. So they're basically, it's part of the community. And one of the Jewish families that invited us in, she was like, I'm not going to be there in the morning, you guys wake up. The coffee's up, you guys can get your own coffee. So I'm going to go see my girlfriends, and then I'll come back for lunch. So there's a social component to it for sure. And what's really interesting and eye-opening is that when she goes to synagogue, she sits over here away from her husband. The guys are separated from the women. So it is a very patriarchal environment. And when the guy walks in, he's leading his family in the music. he's leading his family in worship. In the United States, I have to admit, my wife is more probably more leader to my discredit than I am. And so a lot of times men have not taken that responsibility, but in Jewish culture, the man is definitely leading his household. And it's pretty amazing to watch. And I would say I didn't always see it like positively, because I see it through the American lens and like, oh man, it's all about the guy, because I've been like, no, it needs to be shared. But he was taking leadership, and he was leading his family as the priest in his family, which was pretty neat to see. It was a good example for me. But to kind of give you an idea of the hospitality, so we went to the Sicily as a Hillel, and so we ate with them. We went to synagogue that night. The next morning, I didn't go. It was raining, so Weston and I hung out at the center while they all went to synagogue. Not all of them, because there are secular Jews there too. But when they got back from synagogue, this young woman walked up to me, and she went like this. And I was like, what do you want? And she walks me over, and Weston, you guys were with me, weren't you?
You were watching.
You were watching me. And she walks over to this power bank, and there's all these phones plugged in the power bank. And I'm like, you're going to have to tell me what you want, because I have no idea. And so kind of miming a little bit what to do, I finally figured out that she wanted me to unplug a cell phone. Well, there's like 6 cell phones plugged in. I'm like, you're going to have to tell me which one to unplug. And finally, there were enough people staying around, they just asked me to unplug them all. So I unplugged them, and I thought this was a really weird thing. Why would somebody come up and do this, like not speak, but just sort of act through it? Well, as a Gentile, you're very convenient and very valuable on the Sabbath. Because they are not allowed to unplug their cell phones, they're not allowed to plug in their cell phones, and they're not allowed to tell a Gentile what to do. But if they can get a Gentile to do something, that's fair game. So we got to play in that game a little bit.
Oh, that's fun.
As we left, so the Sabbath ended, the rabbi blessed everything, and he was like, it was dark outside, go guys, the center's closed now. I'm like, I have no place to go. I don't know what to do. It's raining. And so this is the young people of Israel. They said, all right, you guys just come with us. So they grabbed Weston and Aiden and I, and I said, where are we going? So we got it taken care of. They said, we're going to hitchhike tonight. And I was like, oh, Joe's going to kill me. I'm taking her boys hitchhiking in Israel. What was worse is the cars weren't big enough to take us plus the 5 Israeli guys that were with us. So a car pulls up, and they're like, all right, who's going to go with this guy? And I was like, all right, Aiden goes first. So Aiden got in with this Israeli guy, and I was like, I don't know where they're going.
That was the option, the white van.
Was that the white?
Yeah, it was the white van, because it was dark.
Oh, so that was a different one.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was dark. Weston and I, we were walking out towards the bus station there. Highway, we stop, and a white van pulls up. And we jump in this van. It happens to be 3 young women that took us to this address that we had. And somehow, some of the guys in the military knew somebody at a school, and so we stayed with them at a school. But they just took care of us. They took us. Was it tense? It all blends together. But here you have Israelis looking after the sojourner that would have been homeless, would have been sleeping out in the rain, and here they're taking the time to arrange rides, hitchhiking with total strangers, which was kind of crazy, and to find places to sleep. Just a lot of kindness extended towards us. So I want to go back. How much time do I have? 5 minutes?
Yep.
Okay. So I want to touch on something that I mentioned earlier. To call somebody in Israel and say, I'm a Gentile, I'm a Christian, and I want to keep the Sabbath for you, is not gonna buy you any like extra points for sure. I'll talk a little bit about that. So Christians, the Voice of the Martyr says that Israel,
Do they have a lot of crime over there?
they do, because the Bedouin cultures and the Arab cultures don't have a vested interest in the land because they feel like they're just trapped there. So there is not a lot of crime, but there is some crime there, for
So
sure.
wasn't that taking a big chance, hitchhiking?
Well, yes and no, because you're in, the people knew where they were as far as the community. They weren't in a Bedouin community, they weren't in a, remember all the communities are segregated. So we were solidly in a Jewish community that we were hitchhiking in. Yeah. But it probably would not be a good idea to go to the Bedouin community, because when we were hiking, people were like, keep an eye on your bags, because when you're sleeping outside, you do fall asleep, hopefully, and you leave your backpacks right next to you. I mean, you're vulnerable. People can come by and steal stuff for sure. We didn't have that happen, but people warned us about it. And there were terrorist events that happened while we were there and people that were killed. So, yeah, they launched 1,000 missiles into Israel while we were there, out of the Gaza Strip. So but what we think of as dangerous, like we were in Denver last week, and the Nuggets won the NBA, and 11 people got shot. I never heard of that happening in Israel. I mean, Chicago, Kansas City. I would say I felt much safer in Israel than I did there,
Wow.
but I do hear a lot of places. So, the Voice of the Martyr says that Israel is an unreached people group and is hostile to the gospel. And so when we left to go to Israel, we took a bag of some missionary friends with us because they run a missionary program in Israel, and they were threatening him with 5 years in prison if he went back because of evangelizing. And so I took their bags back to their parents. So to be Christian in Israel is a minority position. We went to a church in Tiberias it was a Christian church. They kept the Sabbath, and their church had been burned down 20 years ago, and they met out around the Sea of Galilee outside for like 15 years before they finally could reestablish a church. And they have about 500 members. And then we met with a church in Jerusalem that was also Christian, kept the Sabbath. And they had bought a building, and then the city had come in and told them that their building permit and occupancy permit wasn't valid and they couldn't meet in it. And they got a lawyer, and they were only going back to that building when we went there. So you may say, man, those Jewish people, what in the world are they doing persecuting Christians? We have to remember the history here. So when Martin Luther, the Catholic Church has historically persecuted the Jewish people. You can read about it in Spain, the Inquisitions, and the millions of people that were killed. But Martin Luther, when he was in the Reformation, said that they're the spawn of the devil, we should take all their money. I mean, there is really good documentation that the Protestant Christians have also been very anti-Semitic. And then we were there for Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was a very sober day in Israel. We kept Passover actually with the Holocaust survivors, so that memory is still there, very living and present in the community. And I asked one of the ladies that we were keeping Shabbat with, what they call it there, Sabbath, after I got up enough courage, I said, do you see the Holocaust as being a German issue or a Christian issue? And she didn't answer. And she sat there. I think she was a little floored that I would actually ask that question. And she said, you guys turned your backs on us when we were in our greatest need. So there is a tremendous amount of hurt amongst the Jewish people. And to come in and to evangelize and speak about Christ and try to pull them away from what they see as their culture is really an insult to them. What was interesting is that it was even insulting on top of that to say, can I keep the Sabbath with you and can I keep the holy days with you? So I asked a woman, I said, what do you think about us keeping Sabbath as a Christian and keeping holy days? And she looked at me and she said, it's super awkward. She said, those days were delivered to us. We were the ones that were in Egypt. God delivered those to us. We were the slaves. He gave us the Sabbath as a rest. He gave us these days to remind us that we wandered in the desert. He didn't give that to Christians. In fact, if they knew you were a Christian, they would say, we are going to give you a different set of laws. Noah's 7 laws. Has anyone heard of Noah's 7 laws? Noah's 7 laws are the way the Gentiles can reach salvation. Those are separate. Those are laws that were delivered to Noah and to our entire population. The 10 Commandments, the holy days, those are delivered to the Jews. And so it was awkward for them. What is somebody doing claiming to be a Christian and also keeping our days? They were still hospitable. They were still nice. And it was interesting. The Lord says, be prepared to give an answer. And so I turned around to her and I said, listen, I recognize that you were the firstborn, that God had favor on Israel, that He loves you and He cares for you, and He gave you a responsibility to be a keeper of the law and what He delivered at Sinai. And He did that so you could be a blessing to all nations. So I appreciate you inviting me into your house and being a blessing to us. And the whole mood changed in the room, because now you're valuing them for who they were and the special responsibility that God has given them. And we are grafted into Israel. So there is an appreciation as an unnatural branch being grafted into Israel, spiritually speaking, that we need to acknowledge that there were original branches that were also broken out, that someday will be restored, because there is a tremendous amount of zeal, a tremendous amount of fear and reverence for God. And so at the right time, when God opens their eyes, there will be huge revival in Israel. But for now, their eyes are closed, and the hurts of the past are very real and present in their culture. So it's something to be aware of and understanding as we walk in the paths of the Sabbath and the holy days and the laws, that we do so in a way that is sensitive to the people that have held that for so many years and so many centuries in their communities. So the main takeaways I'd like to leave you with is that the people in Israel are a very hospitable and warm people. They are very open to inviting you in for coffee and serving you food and taking care of you and doing all of those things. Because that is part of their culture, is part of what the Bible says, is be hospitable to the sojourner, be kind to the foreigner, because you once were a foreigner. And so that should really speak to us. Are we as grafted in, as part of the spiritual Israel? Are we being hospitable? Are we being welcome? And are we willing to lay down the hurts in our lives and the offenses that have come into our lives to take care of people that may not see the world through the same lens that we do? Are we willing to lay down our past hurts? Because if there's one thing that I saw, it was a people that have been injured but are still taking risk and investing in people that are sojourning and wandering through their land. So it's a great place. If you ever do go to Israel and you can break out of the tour bus bubble, it is really rewarding. We would go to like these sites, and all the Americans were like in these tour buses, and they were around their tour guides. But it was really interesting because when we were around the Israelis, we were like some of the first Christians I'd ever met, because they are all at the holy sites, but they never got into the rest of the culture. So there are some really neat opportunities. So if you ever get a chance to go, make sure you take the time to get to know the people too. Thank you.